Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Founders Table. This podcast is focused on conversations with current founders to deconstruct their lessons and tactics in order to help you build your own startup. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and subscribe in your podcast app. This will keep you up to date on the latest episodes, as well as help others find out about the show. My guest today is Charity Majors, co-founder and CTO of Honeycomb, a powerful observability platform that helps teams solve problems and answer novel questions about all their services. Before co-founding Honeycomb, Charity made significant contributions at companies like Linden Labs, the creators of Second Life, Parse, and Meta. She has co-authored books, including Database Reliability Engineering and Observability Engineering, and is a frequent speaker at tech conferences. Charity is active on social media and is known for her advocacy of Observability 2.0, testing and production, and thoughts on hiring and career advancement. I've personally been following Charity for a long time now and was super excited to get a chance to talk to her. We cover so much in today's episode, but some of the highlights include Charity's preference for polarizing distinct flavors of single malt scotch and how that translates to other areas of her life. We talk about Observability 2.0, what it is, why now, and why it matters. And we talk about creating truly diverse teams that go beyond race or gender to build both a collaborative and resilient culture. And now, without any further ado, I give you Charity Majors. Charity, welcome to Founders Table. I am super excited to talk to you today.
I am super excited to talk to you today too. Thank you so much for having me.
There are so many places we can begin, but just to start us off on a personal note, I noticed you, in one of your profiles, you mentioned single malt scotch and that being your favorite drink. What is your favorite and why single malt scotch?
Oh boy. I think I like single malt scotch because number one, it's delicious, and number two, it's very polarizing. I really like the really dirty ones. So Ardbeg does a special bottling each year, and one year they had this one called the Supernova, and it tasted like dirt, like black malty dirt. And that was when I was like, I'm in love. Like it's not, nobody's like, this is okay. It's either like, this is like set a new bar for me in terms of things I put in my mouth. I will never forget this experience. Or you're like, take it away. Never let me smell it. Never let us ever speak of this again. And I love it. I also really, I branched out into bourbons as well. And I also really love this one called George C. Staggs. I found it right before it went like nuclear and everyone discovered it. So I have like 3 bottles left over from a few prior years, and now like you can't find it anymore. There's a junior one called Staggs Junior that is pretty good, but like it doesn't compare to the original. But yeah, single malt scotches. There's also this Scotch whiskey club that you can get online where it's like they have numbers instead of brand names. So if you know how to look up the numbers, you can find out, oh, this is from the Lagavulin distillery. But they're all like experimental bottles that the various Scotch manufacturers did. And so they'll be marked with just like a birthday cake and notes of spring. It's like little tone poems on the front. I just love it.
I find it's interesting you mentioned for the single malt scotch, it's like how it's very polarizing. And I find that especially like in your writings and also like your views in observability, I think that's also one of the like attributes I
There's a
kind of
through
think
line.
of. I guess then talking about, I guess, Honeycomb and how that started. As I understand, you met your co-founder, Christine. Well, you got to know her much better at Meta, but you guys had previously worked together at Parse.
We worked together at Parse. We were acquired by Facebook. Yeah.
Got it. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us the story of kind of how you and Christine essentially ended up going from coworkers to co-founders, and what helped you build that conviction to both work together and build a company together.
Yeah. It's so funny because we did not know each other well at all. The CTO that we worked for had this idea that you should sit in the room based on where you sat in the stack. So I was always on one wall as the infrastructure person. She was on the opposite wall as like sort of a front end person. And but I thought really highly of her. And I was also like never one of those kids who's like, I'm gonna start a company one day because I kind of despise more founders than I like founders. Like the ones I really like, but well, this sounds familiar. But the ones that I don't, I really don't like. But when I was leaving Facebook, like I'm not someone who's ever had a pedigree, right? Serial dropout, worked at startup. When I was leaving Facebook, investors were coming to me like, "Would you like $2 million to start a company and do something?" And I was kind of like, "Well, shit. I mean, this is never going to happen again." I feel like I have an obligation to all dropouts and like women and queers and tech to take the money and run. And Christine just happened to email me around that time. I kind of have always had a side gig of like hooking my friends up with jobs, like kind of matchmaking. And she emailed me and she's like, "Do you know of anything interesting going on? Do you know of anyone hiring right now?" And I was like, "Funny you should ask." And it was so interesting because while we were at Parse after the acquisition, we had both had these interesting, very like bookendy experiences, dev and ops, with like the same exact problem. Where the problem I had with Parse was it was like this, million user, you know, mobile app backend as a service with like all of these vast co-tenancy problems and like, instead of, in traditional systems at that point, you had your ramp stack, right? And things tend to fail in pretty predictable ways. And with Parse, every time we got paged, it was something different. And we'd just be starting from scratch, like, what the hell is it, which is really impossible to do when all you have is like aggregates and, random exemplars. And so, like, the first, like, glimmers of light that we got was when we started feeding some of our data sets into this Facebook tool called Scuba. And instead of just being like, not on our dashboards, where do we start? It was like you could follow the trail of breadcrumbs. Because Scuba at the time was not a fun tool to use. I've often said it's like aggressively hostile to users, uh, but it let you slice and dice in real time on high cardinality dimensions. So you could break down by flow requests, right? Group by like app ID and look for which apps had the requests that were the slowest. Or you could break down by raw query or normalized query, or you just and like it went from us taking like hours or days to figure out what each new problem was to like seconds. Like, every time. Doop, 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 there's the answer. Which was like after you've had an experience like that, you can't go back, right, to the battle way. So Christine, coming from the other side, Christine had actually single-handedly built our parse metrics product. And she had this issue where, we were using Cassandra to back it, traditional time series columnar data store, time series data store. And she had built this product for our users where our users could define up front which data they wanted to collect, and then they could ask questions about it. But reality being what it is, they always wanted to ask new questions, right? And you don't know what to ask until it's happened, and then so this whole chicken and egg problem. You can only find what you're looking for, and you can only ask questions that you thought to ask in advance. And so Christine was in this really frustrating state. Christine has very high standards for herself, and like she built this Parsley Analytics product, and our users were constantly writing in with frustration, and she would have to manually go to Scuba and look up the information and give it to them. And she was just like, this violates all of my ideas about what software should be like. And so she saw this as like a chance to get it right. And so we together were like, okay, we'll build this tool, Scuba for, the world. It's probably only going to be relevant to really big platforms, right? This doesn't seem like a general purpose need. And we'll probably fail, but what the hell? We've got the money. Let's do this for a little bit. And it was over the course of that first year of building and trying to figure out how to talk about what we were doing and how it was different from existing logging and monitoring that it started to slowly dawn on us that oh, this is not just a problem that large multi-tenant platforms have. Like this is becoming an everybody problem. Everybody's blowing up the monolith. Everybody's going from this simple lamp stack to like far-flung, chaotic, distributed systems where you can't predict what's going to break. And by the time it's broken, you didn't know to ask the questions, you can't find it. And it's just like, everybody's sort of arriving at this tipping point of complexity where the old ways, what got you here, just won't get you there. And so I am as shocked as anyone that it's 8.5 years later and it's still going. It's been fun. Christine is amazing.
I think both of you have been pretty spectacular, and as well as the company Honeycomb itself. Um, a lot of follow-ups I want from that, but I guess first of all, I think you mentioned you left Facebook, and it sounds like investors were kind of pushing at your door of here, take this money and start something. I think there are a lot of especially software engineers that have like ambitions of building a startup, and um, most of them go through the process of like, how can I like, for some reason, people have this idea of they need to raise money first before doing an idea, which I'm against, but that's besides the point. I think it's more just like, I think people think about, how do I raise money and have a lot of trouble with it. But it seems like
Yeah.
you had quite the opposite where, and so I'm wondering like, what was it about your situation or yourself where you basically, it sounds like getting the money wasn't the hard part. Was that something about like the times you were in, the your personal accomplishments, or yeah, what do you think contributed to that?
It was the times we were in, and to be clear, raising money has often been a problem with us. It was that first lump that kind of like sort of dropped in our laps, and like we did not know how to pitch, we did not know how to fundraise. So like if there hadn't been someone looking to give money to us, we would have failed. Um, but I would say that in retrospect, I think one of the most valuable things I ever did was learn how to speak in public. Like I started tweeting just to my friends, and I had this really soul crushing fear of speaking out loud in public. Like I would have, I remember having to give an infrastructure presentation of the infrastructure I had built to all 8 or 9 engineers at Parse and having like cold sweats and nightmares about it. And I had to write out the entire script because I didn't trust myself to remember it while I was standing up at a table and like half a dozen people. And I was so bad at it and it was so embarrassing that I just leaned into it hard and I started giving as many talks to as many places as would have me. Like I went from never having spoken in front of anyone to giving like 12, 17 talks in 12 months or something like that, and just like foot on the gas pedal. And also, I got a prescription from my doctor for propranolol, which is like a beta blocker that blocks some of the physical symptoms of, like your cold sweats and everything. Uh, and now that I know that I have ADHD, it's a lot more clear to me. Like anxiety, like adrenaline helps me focus. That makes sense in a way that it didn't really at the time. But like, I think that like there are good sides and bad sides to having a public profile. But I think that if you plan on starting a company, you kind of need to. Like, if you're going to need to talk and pitch yourself again and again and again, like the skill of talking about the engineering that you do and your strategy and being able to think on your feet is not something that most of us are born with. It's a skill. And the only way to build that skill is to do it over and over and over again.
I think it's actually quite inspiring to hear you talk about how public speaking was so terrifying for you in the beginning, because I think contrast that with your public persona and basically like me like just originally only knowing you from like your public talks and the stuff that you put out there, that would definitely not have been something that had crossed my mind. You seem so natural at it, and so
Not
good
natural.
at that.
Everybody thinks that Christine is the introvert and I'm the extrovert, and they could not be more wrong. I am the introvert. I also have a pretty pronounced limp. And the reason I got the prescription was that when my brain would get bombed with adrenaline, I would freeze up and I wouldn't be able to walk, or like my legs would be shaking and I couldn't really even stand up. And so you start having all these additional nightmares about like tripping on stage in front of like hundreds of people. Like it's a lot to get over. But I think you can get over just about anything. So
For if you were to encounter someone that like would like to do more in terms of like speaking in public, um, is there any kind of advice, or if you look back for your own experience, like what has worked well for you to make that a sustainable kind of practice for you?
the main obstacle that most people have is in their heads. They think that nobody wants to hear what they have to say, which is just not true. Like you don't need to say something shaking and surprising and novel. Like every engineer out there has worked really hard on some really interesting things. And if you've spent a couple of years like building something, there's something really interesting in there to talk about. Um, in addition to that, like some, I think that's very generic advice. Some additional advice. I've been trying to figure out how to write about this, but like I feel like a lot of engineers feel some like sort of um, shame, or they don't want to admit that they'd like to be better known. There is no shame in that, like it can be a real, career accelerant, especially if you're like a woman or, come from a marginalized group. It's like, it's such a ninja move because if people are inclined to look at you and sort of like round your expertise down, the opposite happens if they Google your name and it comes up next to technology. They round you up. They assume you're an expert. Everyone who works in tech who comes from a marginalized background should make sure that when you Google their name, it comes up next to some piece of technology that they care about. It's such a master move. It means whenever you're looking for a job, you're like, oh, well, they must be an expert in Kubernetes. They give a tech talk on that, you know? And like, honestly, many of the best talks I've ever gone to were ones where I actually knew the material pretty well, but it was presented in a way that made me understand some nuances that I hadn't before, or it walked me through it through the fresh eyes of a beginner, or it was funny, it was entertaining. They're having some personality in the talk. The ones that get, tweeted and like reshared and shared are not usually the ones where like, oh my God, that is some brand new computing research. It's like, oh my God, I relate to that and I learned something and I want to tell my friends about it. So, I think that everyone who's ambitious in their career, which you don't have to be. You don't have to be. There's no rule that says you need to be super ambitious. But it's a real accelerant. It's really good for your career to get better at these things.
Yeah, I would say plus 100 to that. I find public speaking, public writing, anything you put out there, like it just compounds like nothing else. If you do it well and would, and so, there are definitely different ways of doing that. I also find that at least for me initially, I had that blocker of like if I put something out there, it needs to be like something new or I have to have something interesting to say. But I also find that we usually also have a high bar of that, like
Yeah,
because we do the same thing day in and day out. We just assume that everybody knows this or it's common
yeah,
knowledge, but that's not necessarily true. And even if it is, it's also just bringing your new perspective to it, or maybe
yeah,
just voicing something that we all think, but in a new way that like really resonates with other people. And so all this just to say, it's like when putting things out there, um, it's very easy to have a high bar, and when in reality like it's a lot of it I find is just putting your perspective
yeah.
on the things that you have a lot that you've been doing.
Yeah, and also like from a personal perspective, the things that I have written about or spoken about are the things that I remember the best. And the things that turn out to be the most meaningful for me. Like when I was at Linden Lab for 5 or 6 years, my first real job after I dropped out of college, I worked in a lot of stuff. I only wrote about one thing. I wrote about this year-long effort that I did. So we had upgraded from MySQL 4.1 to 5.0, and it was a catastrophe. We had to roll back with those last 2 days of data. And then I spent a whole year working on building some like A/B, capture and replay 24 hours worth of traffic, do some, tweaking, blah blah blah. I wrote that up at the end. Been lost in the shadows of time now, but like that is the thing that I remember the most from that entire like half decade of my life. I still think of it. I still remember the lessons. I refer back to it. It's been like, and when I think about the work that I did with MongoDB, I wrote about so much of it, and it's still like crystal clear in my mind today. I can't say that about most of the things that I've ever done.
Yeah, I think writing definitely ties very much into both like sharpening your thinking, but also it's like crystallizing it.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned, when you first started Honeycomb, you were working on the pitch and everything else. And maybe that's like a good starter for like one for people who are not familiar with honeycomb, if you can like describe what is honeycomb. And then the second part, just to tee it up, is kind of like how has the description changed over time? Like how did you describe it, when you first started, and how do you describe that today?
Yeah. That's such a great question because it has changed so many times, and it's still like recently I've been thinking about how to describe like the deep story of like why do people actually buy us, because it's not laundry list of features. But the way that I would describe it is basically by um, Observability 1.0 versus 2.0. Observability 1.0 are, tools that are built on, there are three pillars, right? There are metrics, logs, and traces. You typically need to buy a RUM tool, an APM tool, a logging tool, or two or three, a tracing tool, a profiling tool, like all these different tools. And then you, the engineer, sits in the middle, and it's just like, well, that shape looks like that shape, right? You're copy pasting IDs around. Um, and like those tools have like brought us a long way. Primitives are many decades old at this point. Observability 2.0, of which Honeycomb is, I think, the first, but I think the first of many to adopt this model, is where you have a single source of truth. Your data comes in these arbitrarily wide structured blocks. And you have, you have IDs attached to them so that you can visualize them as a trace. You can also slice and dice. You can zoom in. You can zoom out. You can have as much cardinality as you want. You can have all the data types you want. It's like, when you start thinking about it, it's like, how do we not have this already? All of these are not, these are solved problems. They've had them in BI for decades, right? They've had the ability to slice and dice and zoom in and zoom out and derive your dashboards from the data that you're using to do the deep debugging. Like we couldn't survive as businesses if we couldn't do this sort of cohort analysis and tease out like, oh, well, these users have these things in common. Oops, wow, that looks like a big similarity. Maybe we should be, like this is not, and yet in the systems and application land, it's like the cobbler's children have no shoes. We're dealing with these technologies from the 80s and 90s, and it's like, it's like baffling to me how we've gotten this far. Like, there's no question in my mind that like 5 years from now, with the escalating like complexity of systems, you can't keep trying to tie together all these disparate sources of data with your gut instincts and your guesses and your intuition, right? So Honeycomb is, I think of it Observability 2.0. And it looks a lot like, it's like BI, but for systems and application data. I think that like another way of thinking of it is like, we're used to having one set of tools for ops, one set of tools for application, another set of tools for business data. But all of the interesting questions that we need to ask and understand about our systems, like components of all three, right? If you're trying to understand, another thing about Observability 1.0 versus 2.0 is that I think the previous generations of tools have been about operating your software. It's about bugs, problems, errors, MTTR, MTTD. It's always like it's a trailing, it's reaction, right? Like it's you're catching up to a problem and figuring it out. Observability 2.0, this gets more into the socio-technical bits, but it's the technical bits that unlock this capability. But it's much more about proactively understanding your software. And this isn't just about bugs and errors. It's about this code that I'm writing. Is it doing what I think it should? Is it doing what I expect it to do? Is it having the business impact that I want it to? Are people using it? How are they using it? How do I wish they were using it? Right? Being able to ask these questions in real time in very frictionless environment so that it feels like part of the development process. Right? Like I feel like, like I was thinking about the analogies to like virtualization really recently. Virtualization is not a new technology. It's been around since the 70s, right? In the late 90s, VMware came along and virtualized it as a product. And that's what unlocked all these waves of socio-technical transformation, right? It opened the door to cloud computing and software as a service and platforms as a service. But it's also what kicked off the DevOps before virtualization, you had ops, which is grounded in hardware and operating systems, and you had devs that are touch the applications, and they barely overlapped, right? They barely touch. Once you had virtualization, suddenly you can start treating your and like, and it's like, oh wow, and like it's been like 20 years since then. And it took like 10 or 15 years to get to these very pithy sort of slogans like cattle not stop hugging servers, right? Or small technical change, but it unlocks like these waves of socio-technical transformation. And I feel like at this point, we're in the waning days of the DevOps era because there increasingly aren't two pillars that need to collaborate and have empathy for them. There's engineers who write code and operate and run their code in production, right? Which is the way that it should be. But I feel like one of the things that needs to happen to sort of like fulfill the promise of the DevOps movement is to have tools for understanding your software that are native to software, not native to ops. And the thing about like metrics, I trash talk metrics a lot. They're not a bad thing. They're really powerful for summarizing vast quantities of data. They're not a tool that you can use for understanding in detail, exploration, right? They're for summarizing. And yet we've like overloaded this like building block and tried to make it do everything. It can't do everything. Right? And like so many people are like trying to understand their software by using these old tools where you have to predict in advance the questions you're going to ask. You only have access to aggregate and random exemplars, and that's just not it's not enough, right? You're stuck in this world where you're trying to translate your functions and API calls and everything into the language of operations, and it's too much. It can't really be done well. And I feel like I know I'm just talking, but like one more thing I want to talk about, which is TDD, right? Like TDD, before TDD, we just wrote code and shipped it and found out about regressions or problems when our users complained. That was absurd, right? TDD comes along, it's like, okay, here's the standard. Now you know whether or not your code works. But TDD comes from an era when you had the database, the web tier, and the application. All of that complexity within the application. So you could test it. TDD has been losing ground in efficacy for a decade or more because increasingly that complexity it's all over the fucking place. It's not in the app anymore. It's in thousands of microservices, it's in third-party platforms, it's in serverless snippets and Lambda jobs and SDKs and APIs. And like the hardest problem is not how do I fix my code, it's where in the fucking system is the code that I need to fix, right? And so TDD, like I'm not saying people should still write tests, right? I'm not saying don't write tests, but I'm saying like it's not enough. And you can't just develop and say my test run, I'm done. Like if you ever could, you really can't. Now, you don't know if your code is working or not until you have practiced something more like observability driven development, where you instrument your code as you're going, you look at it in production through the lens of the instrumentation you just wrote, and you're like, what's it doing? Is this what I expect? Anything else looks weird? And that's the process where you get ahead of you make sure that you find it and your users don't. You can't do that if all you have is aggregates and exemplars. You have to have the sort of like technical edition of observability 2.0 that we have, where it's like you've got these wide structured events that have all of this detail that's bundled in this way so that so when you flip a flag or you ship a diff, you can see what exactly happened, what exactly changed.
So much to unpack there, and I think if I summarize, it's a lot of like the old ways of observability is reactive, and the tools that you have very much rooted in an ops landscape and asking questions that you've already instrumented for, versus with Observability 2.0 and kind of this fusion of like if we take DevOps to be a thing that people practice. And then it's translating that into more a software-driven approach, asking questions that we might not have known we needed to ask beforehand. And essentially, it's the complexity now is not in our system, but how our system interacts with, God knows what else our system might be interacting with, either from our part or a customer's part. And that's a vast combinatorial space that essentially you can't um, uh, deterministically kind of plan for using old tools versus
Exactly.
having this a new stack. One question I have is Observability 2.0. I know that at least for me, I've first heard it from you. Is this something that you coined, and like how did that come about?
Yeah. So last fall, I started doing just sort of being like, why? So like whenever you're trying to figure, come up with a business strategy, you can listen to the people who are your customers and the people who you've talked to who didn't buy. But like the hardest group to reach is the people who never showed up on your doorstep. And so I was kind of like, I wonder if people will just want me. I started just doing sort of random outreach on LinkedIn to people with like observability engineering in their titles, or like who are VPs or CTOs, and just being like, what are your big problems? Like, have you heard of honeycomb? What is your impression of us? What do you think we do? And being like, here's what I'm thinking about. Does this resonate with you? And the language just sort of came out of my mouth as I was trying to figure out how to very like if I get 30 minutes with any engineering leader on earth, they will come away going, "Oh my god, we need honeycomb." But I don't get 30 minutes. I don't get 3 seconds with most of the people on earth, right? So like just trying to figure out how to like characterize them, because a lot of them are like, "Yeah, we pay for these tools. They're very expensive, but they get the job done." I'm trying to figure out how to characterize, yeah, but the job that you're defining is reactive, it's operational, there's so much more. The hardest thing to explain to people is what they haven't experienced. Because, and I'm not complaining about this, it's a good problem to have, but like I will say, all the vendors in the industry have really copied a lot of the things that we've been saying, right? About high cardinality and about, observability and explorability and all this stuff. And so like we sound just like everyone else. So it's kind of this constant struggle to be like, but there's something really different there. If you talk to our users, they're like, "Oh my god, honeycomb is very different." But like, and so 1.0 versus 2.0 was just like, okay, so there's a generational shift, right? And here's how I'm trying to describe it.
Do you find so? I've talked to some people in the observability space, having done something in the observability space myself, and I know specifically, like, what do you say to those customers that might be, hey, I've heard Charity talk about Observability 2.0, and it sounds amazing, but we barely have 1.0.
Yeah,
We're just trying to get to 1.0. Do you encounter that, and what do you do when you see that?
all the time, all the time. And it's so funny if you think about it, because we don't hear people say, "Oh my god, MySQL 8 sounds amazing." We're still trying to figure out how to get to MySQL 5. The reality is that the way people are doing things now is so hard. It is so hard. Um, Trying to like figure out how to get the questions that you need to ask out of building tools like metrics. Like I've talked to so many observability engineering teams who spend an outright majority of their time managing costs, which means managing cardinality, because cardinality is so desperately useful and necessary. It's so cost prohibitive. And so they're constantly just like trying to thread this line, and it's not very automatable. You're trying to train all these developers in how to capture telemetry this way, and then how to build the dashboards, and then how to like master all these different tools. Aren't really really hard. With Observability 2.0, it is so much easier. And something that we've seen over and over again is if you put a new grad in front of Observability 2.0, they're like, "Oh, this makes sense," because it really doesn't. It speaks to you in the language of endpoints and variables and functions. And like, you get used to the interface and you're like, "Oh, okay, so I want to, break down my app ID. I want to group by, perform." It's really intuitive. Trying to teach them to use dashboards and logging and tracing tools is like an advanced maneuver. It takes a long time. The difficulty in Observability 2.0 is not difficulty, it's novelty. Um, Almost everyone would be better served. I mean, if you've got something that's working for you and it doesn't take a lot of your time or energy and you can find what you're looking for, you have no reason what to change. I get that. I would never try to. there's cost in switching. I would never try to convince someone to switch to a different tool in the same genre unless I'm confident it will give them an order of magnitude better utility than what they're getting now. But this whole idea that people are wrestling with 1.0 and it's so hard and it's so complex on their way to 2.0 is really kind of tragic because it's so hard and the difficulty never stops, right? Because it's like, and anybody who works with data knows this intuitively that like if you're using the wrong data model for the job you're trying to do, it is going to be hella expensive and painful and everything is just, and fundamentally that's just the case with people using metrics, logs, and traces to try to understand these massive distributed systems.
Yeah, so I think one thing I'm taking from that is like if you have difficulty adopting 1.0 and you're still trying to kind of go along it, it could be easier actually just to do 2.0 entirely
Versus a bunch of software engineers. Because
right.
if your software engineer is trying to fit your mental model into an ops space so you can operate your software, there's just like lots of layers of hard in that are kind of unnecessary.
So there's a lot more we can do. Definitely, we can do the whole episode on observability itself. But one of the things I did is I asked your co-founder Christine for some like interesting topics we might go down, and one of the things she mentioned was hiring and kind of how you guys have been very intentional in hiring and building your team in Honeycomb. One of the topics is spicy hiring principles, and I believe you also wrote a blog post about that. I think some things that stand out to me is this idea of like like the communication itself is like the interview versus like the lead code parts of the traditional interviews, or like trying to have candidates at their best. And I guess like having done kind of your process for as long as you have, um, well, first it's like, what has been controversial or what do you find like people react to in terms of your quote unquote spicy hiring principles? And how has it worked out for you?
Um, it's worked out spectacularly. Oh my gosh, we have such a great team. Spicy hiring takes. I feel Christine always talking me up. I just feel like they're incredibly boring and just like it's just that people are kind of afraid to try something new. And that's the beautiful thing about being a startup is like you get to try new things, right? Um, so many of those principles I feel like are just because interviewing is so stressful. It is so hard to be your best at an interview. And you would think that in an environment where you've got these highly skilled engineers who really have their pick of jobs, it shouldn't feel so fraught. It shouldn't feel like you're under a microscope being judged for who you are and how good you are. But somehow it does, right? And so one of the other things that I've written about is just like I think I wrote a blog post, 17 reasons I don't hire you or something like that, because very few of them are like, or none of them are you suck, right? Most of the people that we interview are like amazing. And oh my God, I wish we had more money so we could hire more people because like it is like heart wrenching trying to make some of these decisions. Um, but like I feel like to be successful at hiring, I think the first principle has nothing to do with other people. It has to do with you. It has to do with knowing who you are as an organization, having a strategy, having a mission, and knowing the fewer things you absolutely need, the better, right? You should like people tend to have these laundry lists of like we need to hire people who know all these things and have all these shit. Most of that shit doesn't matter. They're gonna learn something else anyway. Um, I feel really strongly about the one where the communication is the interview though, because I find that if you can explain to me how you did something, what you decided against, why you decided those things, but you might decide if the conditions were you would write the fucking code. And the reverse is not always true. There are lots of people out there who can go headphones on, go heads down, write a lot of great code, but they can't talk you through it. So that's a really intentional cultural thing that we select for. We select for good communication. And that means that there are a lot of amazing engineers who we don't choose to hire. And it's not because they suck. It's because this is what we select for. And we try to be really open about that. Because we believe really strongly that when it comes to technical hiring, it's about composing teams, not hiring individuals, right? We want people to come on with a team mentality. We want engineering managers who are hiring to be thinking about what are the skills I have? What are the things that I have to do in the upcoming months? And also, I feel like I must have writing an article about this. It's like been like drawing blood, but like some of it has to do with diversity. I don't really have this allergy to a lot of the DEI industrial complex. I don't feel comfortable talking about it. I don't really feel a lot of it feels very like I don't know, self-made. Like we're paying a lot of money to DEI consultants who do a lot of DEI stuff. But like I, and yet creating fair, environments and teams really deeply does matter to me. So like when you're composing teams, knowing who you are, what you're looking for, and then thinking about diversity not as I need to check these boxes, but rather what are the axes of diversity that the team, for each candidate, what would they add? Is I think so much more interesting than like, well, we don't have that, we don't have this color skin, but like, you know, and you can take this too far and be like, well, we only care about ideological diversity, which is pretty bullshit. But like adding an older person to your team, maybe what you really need at this point in time is you've got a bunch of young ones. You need an older engineer whose heart is genuinely, as a mentor and loves just like spending all day doing. Not all engineers do, right? Not all older engineers do. But if you find an older engineer just like, yes, I love teaching, and then here, let's have an interview session where I'm mentoring you. That is brilliant. If like you've got a bunch of if you're adding a parent, that adds something to your team. If you're adding somebody who's come from an enterprise background and all you have are startup kids, that adds something interesting to your team. We all know that monocultural teams can move really fast in the short term, and when it was just like 5 of us for the first 2 or 3 years, there wasn't a whole lot of diversity. Uh, but I think we all should know by now that when it comes to building for not just the short term, but over the longer term, and building for resiliency so that you can attack problems creatively and, the diversity really matters. And it's not, you know, creating an atmosphere, a culture where diversity is valued in all of its shapes and forms is about creating a culture where you can ask questions, where it's safe to not know things, where, we can talk about how stupid we did some things and that's fine, right? Because we're all here to learn. And that's where I think selecting for communication is so key because, the best teams aren't necessarily the ones that start out with the best engineers. It's the ones that get a little bit better every single day. And that happens by talking to each other and like having an environment where people feel free to take chances and fuck up a little.
Yeah, I mean, definitely so many good points. I think as communication, I've definitely seen as like in terms of like building teams. I almost think of it as like if you have a bunch of really good engineers, like maybe their skills will stack up linearly, or sometimes not because they'll butt heads or if they have bad communications. But with communications, you get into like that principle of like a team that works together with good communication gets better, maybe not like exponentially, but definitely like a multiple that is non-linear,
Oh, I
because you build
love
up
that.
trust. That,
That I'm writing
um,
it down.
yeah, I guess the other part is I think you've published posts about which your thoughts on hierarchies, which is like you're not a big fan of them. And I guess like you've worked at companies like Meta, for example. Like I think the way they deal with hierarchy is like traditionally in the day to day, you don't necessarily know the level of the person you're dealing with. Um, and versus like most places, it's very like okay, like this is a VP, this is a senior, this is a principal, blah blah blah. I guess like what are your yeah like in terms of hierarchy at Honeycomb and hierarchy today, like how do you think about hierarchy in kind of like the day-to-day working environment? Sorry if that's a little bit vague.
No, it's cool. I love this topic. In theory, nobody knew each other's level. In reality, they just weren't allowed to talk about it. So like, I think that was an interesting experiment that just kind of like ended up backfiring. It also meant that a lot of engineers, because they weren't able to put their level on their LinkedIn or whatever, from a career perspective. So I'm all for a good experiment, but I'm not sure that one. I think always, whenever this topic comes up, I always end up thinking back to that brilliant essay on the tyranny of structuralists, about how when there is no explicit hierarchy still exists, but it's informal, it's not accountable to anyone, you don't know who to go to, people have different ideas about who, and that accountability aspect, I think, is so important. Like if you care, like we all care, I say this all the time, but like the Dan Pink thing about how what we care about in our work is autonomy and mastery and meaning, right? And autonomy without accountability is just chaos, right? Like we want to be accountable to things. That's what gives us that sense of ownership, right? Is knowing that it matters. So I don't know. I think for me, what defanged the idea of hierarchy, I used to get very sensitive to like performances of dominance. I, I have such a knee-jerk reaction to that. It's not entirely helpful. But I think what defanged the idea of hierarchy for me was when I was reading about, system theory, and that hierarchy emerges in natural self-organizing systems. And it emerges for the benefit of the leaf nodes, not for the benefit of the top nodes, but for the leaf nodes. And it emerges to organize. And in natural hierarchies, we look up for meaning and down for function. I also kind of like to just visualize hierarchies as like upside down. It's like you're not like at the top of the mountain, but you're supporting the whole fucking company, which I think is really, morally speaking, you should think about it. It's a big responsibility. And there are really good, valid reasons for not wanting to be like under the burden of all of that, that hierarchical structure. There's a lot of liberty in being an IC. There's a lot, I feel like it's very natural to go through a period in your life after you've tried management, after you've started a company or something, you're like, learned a lot, ready to not do that for a while. Maybe I'm going to go have kids. Maybe I'm going to go get married. Maybe I'm ready for my life to not eat up every single like moment of my brain for a while. And like, I'm just ready to go put my head down, build something meaningful, and there is so much power in having those individuals in your organization. Like baby engineers, nobody believes managers at a certain point, right? Like, because they know managers have to speak on behalf of the company. And there are so many situations that even great companies get into where, management is not able to talk openly about the situation for privacy reasons, for legal reasons, for, respect reasons. And inexperienced people tend to jump to conclusions that are somewhat conspiratorial. And having an experienced former manager in the mix who would just be like, I hear you, kids, but also have you considered that this might be going on, or this might be going on, or this might be going on? And you can just see it kind of sink in, and they're going, oh. So the question is, do you trust your leaders and the way they make judgments and decisions or not? That's up to you. But like, this doesn't automatically mean there's a conspiracy, and it doesn't automatically mean that the person who's out there running their mouth is right. So, I think that like the more you can sap hierarchy of its authoritarianism, the healthier it is for everyone. The more you can make hierarchy a functional thing instead of because we're all monkeys, right? And we have these very like inherent hierarchical, like we pay attention to the people that are above us, we have this like, especially after we get out of school and we're like, well, we just spent years like climbing this ladder, and the instinct is to keep climbing the ladder because that's what matters, right? It takes a while to unlearn those reflexes, but I think it's really, really healthy for us to unlearn those reflexes and start to learn to follow our, what do I actually love doing? Where do I actually feel happy? Where do I feel fed? And where am I needed?
Are you going to comment about like thinking of hierarchy less in terms of authority, but kind of like functional components? It reminds me, I forget which book, but I think it's like great leaders eat last. Like you're the one like leading by following. You're the one
Yeah.
supporting the organization. Um, Christine, I have so much more to ask you, but I want to be respectful of your time because we're running close. So
I
I'm
know,
going to
I'm sorry.
transition
I
to my.
just start talking and talking. I need like a little
It's
warning
all
buzzer.
It's all wonderful. I think it just means like maybe at some point we can do a part two of it.
Anytime.
For now, in terms of closing questions, I generally start off with advice in terms of if you were talking to a new founder today, or maybe yourself like 8 years ago, what kind of advice would you give them starting off today?
Oh man. You know, the number one thing is life isn't fair. It just isn't. It isn't fair. And everything out there that you're hearing is survivorship bias. There I love this book by Ben Horowitz. You don't usually hear me say this about investors. I have a love hate, mostly hate relationship with most of them, but the book that Ben Horowitz wrote, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, it's
Hmm.
such an important lesson to internalize. Your path is your own. The hard thing about hard things is they're fucking hard. It means there isn't a recipe. There isn't a playbook. The future is unknown and unknowable. You're going to try your best, and it might not be good enough. And if that screws with your head, then you probably shouldn't do this thing. Like if you're in it to win it and that's the only acceptable outcome, I don't think that's super healthy. My personal philosophy is that everything fails. It's just a matter of time, and I choose to be pleasantly delighted sometimes that things succeed, which maybe isn't the most inspirational stance for other guys to take. It's psychologically healthy for me. And the second thing that I would say is probably the most trite, banal advice in the world, but it's one that really tripped me up, which is you don't have anything if you don't have your health. And you have to put your oxygen mask on before you can do anything for anyone else. And um, it always feels like you don't have a choice in the moment, but you do. You have a choice. And, um, I ran my health and my life into the ground. It took me years to recover, and I thought I was doing what had to be done, but it didn't. There were other ways around that mountain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you don't have to make a false choice. It can definitely seem like it's one or the other, and the truth is like you probably won't have either if you neglect yourself to start off with.
Exactly.
Um, Next, when you think of success, is there any person or any kind of like action or milestone that comes to mind?
And I think of success. I mean, you mean money? Other people?
It can be successful for you or like other people that you think are like have been successful in your mind
Interesting.
or
I know,
embody what that
I
means to
know a
you.
lot of, I know a lot of people have like mentors and people they look up to, and there are definitely people I admire, but I don't really have that kind of. I see everyone as my peer. They probably don't see me as their peer, but like I see everyone as my peer because I had kind of fucked up relationships with people who I see as being above or below me. I see everyone as my peer. I think that people are. I really admire in success. Um, here's something I'll say. I feel like when it comes to founders and people who talk a lot about starting and running companies, there tend to be people who we've all seen really shitty people, really shitty cultures succeed. So clearly that's no impediment to success. Honestly, like if you really focused on the business, that's kind of a necessary ingredient to succeed. And there's been kind of a backlash to that, which has taken the form of people going, you have to have a great culture to succeed, or your culture should come first. I still don't believe that. I think if your business doesn't come first, you're almost certainly going to fail. Your business has to come first. I think that having a great culture can be an incredible accelerant. I think it can be a great risk sort of mitigator. I certainly think it's a more moral and humane way to live. But um, I think there are very few companies that sort of like are focused on the business and also have really strong morals. And the thing is, I think that's a false dichotomy. I don't believe in it. I definitely was someone who started out being like, I care more about culture than the health of the business. Fortunately, we survived that phase barely. And now I'm like, no, the business absolutely comes first. And part of the reason I feel so strongly about that is that like we need to show these motherfuckers that it's possible. Now I really don't. I used to be like not that attached to whether or not we failed. Now I'm really attached to it because I want to show that the things that I care about in the world are not preventing you from success, that they can be a superpower and an accelerant.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, there are plenty of, well, there are definitely examples of kind of really kind of shitty environments still making it, I think. Being kind of the the sass at the top of, the metaphorical hill, like showing people that you can do
Yeah,
it. But
yeah.
um, all right, my very last question, which is a kind of a two for one, it's asking offers. Do you have anything you would like to request from my audience or anything you would like to offer?
Ooh, I do have a discount code. I think it puts me up with one, so I'll give it to you so you can put it in the show notes. If anyone wants to try using honeycomb, um, we have a free tier, but I think we have a pretty substantial discount. You're also welcome to use. And if you do, I'll send you an email and ask how it's going. And ask, boy, that's a great question. Honestly, if there are people out there who don't use honeycomb, who would be willing to have a chat with me about wanting one, find me on LinkedIn. I would love to just hear more about that. Um, it's really interesting to me. There are very good reasons for not using honeycomb. I'm not gonna like be mad at you or yell at you or anything, but I'm just really curious. It's really hard to get that kind of raw, unfiltered feedback from people you don't know. So that would be a real gift. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll add everything in the show notes, discount codes, where to find charity, and everything else. And in the meantime, thank you so much for talking to me. This has been everything I'd hoped for and more. And um, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been really fun for me too. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Hey, just one more thing before you go. Thanks for listening to this episode of Founders Table. If you like the show, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also consider giving us a rating as it helps others find the podcast. You can find all episodes as well as more information about the show at founderstable.co. Until next time, stay hungry.